The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. I hope you're doing well. I thought I'd check in with you after a few weeks and a very busy May for myself at Embark Chemical Consulting. I had a number of events in May, including CTAC Vienna, an event in the University of Liverpool called Designing for Circularity on Biodegradable Chemicals and Polymers, and finally Chem UK. And what I found after all these events was that I left feeling really energized, really inspired, had some fantastic discussions whilst I was at these different events, and saw some really good talks, some really interesting science, and it's left me with a lot to think about in how we're addressing chemical hazards and risks in the broader context of human society. Following that and a nice week off in Denmark with my family, I've come back to work now, and I've got a very busy month of delivery in June and July. I might be going a little bit quiet, let's see. But I really wanted to get in touch with you all and keep the momentum going on this podcast. And for this episode, my plan is to read another one of my articles. This time it's about the new hazard classes under the EU CLP regulation. That's the classification, labelling and packaging of substances and mixtures. And this is an article which I originally sent out in my newsletter on the 24th of June 2024 and later published on LinkedIn. And I've had to adapt it a little bit because of some developments which I'll tell you about. But much of the article, as I wrote it, seems to be playing out the way that I thought. And we can touch on that as well. And I'll also follow on from this with some more recent developments and how these fit in to the broader context. So, how should we expect the new hazards under EU CLP to play out in practice? The new hazard classes are now enforced under the EU CLP regulation. This means that all entities placing substances or mixtures on the European single market, barring a few exceptions, will soon be required to classify their products according to these new hazards. As put by the European Chemicals Agency, these changes are expected to have a far-reaching impact. And this is not least because of the links that CLP has with many other EU laws. As a reminder, the new hazard classes are endocrine disruptors for human health and the environment, persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic or very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances, and persistent, mobile and toxic or very persistent and very mobile. But what do these developments mean in practice? How are they likely to play out in the years ahead? In this article, I'll offer a perspective and argue how, along with some other key challenges, the new hazards will fundamentally transform the way the EU CLP regulation operates. Although the eagerly awaited guidance in the new hazards is not expected to be available until the autumn, that's autumn 2024, deadlines for classification start as early as the 1st of May 2025 for substances. By this date, all substances placed on the market and in scope for classification under the CLP regulation will need to be evaluated, classified and labelled according to the new hazards before they can be placed on the market. But do we expect many substances to be brandishing these new classifications on their labels and SDS by this time? My suspicion is no. And I say this for three overarching reasons. Reason number one is lack of data. In many cases, these will be new assessments for the substances in question. The potential for these substances to exhibit endocrine disruption or to pose a threat to drinking water is unlikely to have been considered before. Even in the case of PBT and vPvB assessments, which in principle should be accessible from the publicly available registration dossiers of most REACH registered substances, these will not have been performed for substances that have been registered at less than 10 tonnes per annum, or those that are exempt from registration, such as polymers. This means that addressing the responsibilities of the new CLP hazards will be far from an information lookup exercise in practice. In the case of PMT and vPvM assessments, many substances are likely to lack conclusive information on persistence or mobility, for the very reason that it has, until now, not been a requirement to assemble this information. For persistence assessments, biodegradation simulation tests are the standard information used to reach conclusions for non-readily biodegradable substances. However, there are only a limited number of simulation tests in the REACH database. The scarcity of data from simulation tests is not really a surprise, given the cost, complexity, and perceived risk from false positives, for instance, of these tests. It's a similar story for the mobility assessments. The mobility classification is brand new, and as mentioned, the guidance is not yet finalised. It seems pretty clear that the organic carbon normalised soil water partition coefficient, or KOC, will be the principal endpoint for classifying substances for this concern. However, adequate data, even for such a screening level endpoint, is often missing from registration dossiers. So, you might ask, will the new hazards under CLP trigger a wave of new testing? The short answer is probably not. The CLP regulation has no mechanism to require assessors to carry out further data generation for health or environmental hazards. It is therefore more likely that assessors will try to make do with whatever data is available. In most cases, this information will be inadequate for classification, and as a result, substances will not be classified for these new hazards. Reason number 2 is lack of expertise. One thing that is common to assessments of endocrine disruption, persistence, bioaccumulation, and mobility is that all of these assessments rely on a process known as weight of evidence. Weight of evidence is a somewhat opaque process that involves gathering and evaluating disparate pieces of evidence and combining these into a single conclusion. It necessarily relies on expert judgment. There's a reason why ECHA expert groups dedicated to these assessments have been established. However, with the introduction of the new CLP hazards, these responsibilities will now fall to individual legal entities who are placing these substances and mixtures on the market. The requirements are the same whether the entity is a small or medium enterprise, a so-called SME, or a large multinational company. For many of the duty holders, these assessments will be completely new, and with hundreds of pages of guidance to pore over, it goes without saying that the new requirements are likely to be overwhelming. It's also not clear that the expertise or capacity to adequately carry out the required volume of assessments exists within the consultancy sector. It therefore remains to be seen how this expertise gap will be bridged to deliver all of the required assessments in the short time available. Reason number 3 is lack of time. Speaking with people about the new CLP hazards has been something of a strange experience. There doesn't seem to be anything like the urgency that has been expressed for other recent regulatory deadlines. This might be down to mission fatigue, with many companies and individual professionals being weary from all of the legislative changes they've had to deal with lately. However, it could also be due simply to a lack of appreciation for the sheer amount of work standing before them. It's common for regulatory deadlines to get quite close before the urgency triggers action on a massive scale. This has been the case for recent EU and UK REACH deadlines, as well as the CLP Poison Centre deadlines. However, in the present case, this seems like a risky strategy. Each substance is required, in theory, to undergo several assessments: endocrine disruption for human health and environment, persistence, bioaccumulation, mobility, and toxicity. If following a weight of evidence approach, then all available relevant information should be gathered and evaluated, including literature data and adaptations like read-across and QSAR methods. It takes a significant amount of effort to do these assessments justice and to produce the documentary evidence that the necessary work has been done. I suspect that those who have fully contemplated the requirements will be quite concerned about their ability to comply with them. Others likely do not yet appreciate what they're being required to do. A small minority may be adopting a wait-and-see approach to see how the requirements ultimately play out and are enforced in practice. Whatever the reasons, I suspect that industry will simply run out of time to complete these assessments by the deadlines, and as a result, we will not see the anticipated great reclassification of new CLP hazards. However, self-classification may not be the main means by which these new hazards get onto product labels. It has been suggested that the recent changes to the CLP regulation signal a shift in the regulatory strategy for the risk management of chemicals in the EU. Specifically, that harmonised classification, with its subsequent impacts on other EU legislation, will become a more potent mechanism and important tool for chemicals management moving forward. This is supported by the European Commission now having the ability to develop classification and labelling proposals, and an increase in emphasis towards grouping-based harmonised classifications. We're also hearing rumours of member states shifting their focus towards ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee, or RAC, where harmonised classifications are implemented, and some are already in the process of developing harmonised classification proposals. It will be fascinating to see how all of this develops. At the very least, we will see many firsts in the coming years, including harmonised classification of groups of substances. One thing is clear, the developments signal a fundamental shift in the way that the CLP regulation is likely to operate moving forwards, with a greater emphasis on regulator-driven harmonised classification and lesser emphasis on industry self-classification. Is this symptomatic of an overall frustration at the rate of progress of action against harmful chemicals? Or a growing lack of trust in industry to safeguard public health and the environment through the life cycle of its products and operations? Or is it simply an admission that these new hazards were too complex to rely on industry actors to adequately implement them for their substances, and that the originally intended operational model of the CLP regulation had to be sacrificed in order to accommodate them? The answer to this question will surely become clear in time. So, that's my article that I published around 12 months ago. And what has been happening in the 12 months since it was published? Did we see the great reclassification? No, it seems that we haven't seen that yet. Will we see a shift in the way that CLP operates? I think it's still early days for that, and it really remains to be seen. But there are a few things that have happened since the article was published. So first of all, we've had ECHA clarifying the deadlines for when these classifications need to be implemented. And this is one of the main reasons why I've had to adapt my article, because originally there were 2 dates for the deadline for classification of substances and 2 dates for the classification of mixtures. And it depended on when the substance or mixture had been placed on the market, with the 1st of May 2025 deadline being for substances newly placed on the market, and a later date of the 1st of November 2026 for substances that were already on the market. And there'd been a lot of discussion and confusion amongst multiple stakeholders as to what it meant by a substance or a mixture being already on the market. And ECHA has since issued new guidance to clarify this, in that they've basically said new quantities of a substance being placed on the market counts as a new placing on the market. So this is quite a distinction between new versus existing substances and then new quantities of substances. And what it essentially means is that the 1st of May 2025 deadline is the decisive deadline for when substances need to be classified according to these new hazards, because most companies will be manufacturing or importing substances all the time. They won't have huge batches of stock that they place on the market prior to the 1st of May 2025 deadline, and they're certainly unlikely to have that stock lasting them until the 1st of November 2026. A lot of people might have been working to that 1st of November 2026 deadline for taking serious action for these classifications, but it's now been made clear by ECHA that the most important date, and really the only date, is the 1st of May 2025, which of course we're already past that deadline. Another thing that's happened is that ECHA has now issued their guidance under the CLP regulation, and whilst this only came in the autumn, I think we have to give credit to ECHA and all the different stakeholder groups that participated in producing this guidance in such a short amount of time, because it is a very detailed and complex piece of guidance. I've read through quite a few of the sections, and I think it's pretty solid in terms of its coherence and its alignment with other related guidance documents. Overall, I think that is a success, and it gives various actors something to work with when they're trying to classify their substances or their mixtures. And a few features of this guidance. So first of all is that this is the first example of formal guidance around the mobility assessment that is out there. So that is now clear, or at least there's enough information there for people to follow the testing and arrive at mobility classifications, and it's providing a starting point for these assessments to be performed. And ECHA themselves have indicated that there'll be a lot of learning in this process for everyone as we go about generating data and classifying substances and mixtures for their mobility. So watch this space, and if you've had experience working with the mobility hazard class and the classification and you have insights to share, I'd certainly be interested to hear them. There was a lot of discussions at CTAC about the new mobility hazard class. It has dominated a lot of the debate around the PMT and vPvM hazard classes, and there were a lot of discussions at CTAC Vienna, for instance, about this, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. Another notable thing is that the persistence assessment under CLP has got a bit of a difficult job in that it's needed to merge guidance for both plant protection products, which is governed under the EFSA regulator, along with REACH, biocides and pharmaceuticals, which are covered under the ECHA guidance and the ECHA remit. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the future, because there are some notable differences in how plant protection products are assessed for persistence versus the other kinds of substances in the EU. And this CLP guidance is going to draw those differences out, and it may prove to be the wedge that forces through the discussions around one substance, one assessment. Another thing is that the persistence assessment tool gets a mention in this guidance document. So I'm delighted about that. And I'm also really happy to say that we recently finalized the manuscript for the persistence assessment tool, which details the methodology that underpins this tool. And there's a preprint published, which I'll include in the show notes. And I hope that there'll be a peer-reviewed publication for this paper very soon. So another thing that has happened since the publication of my article is that ECHA delivered a webinar on its new guidance that it had produced. And to their credit, they did a good job of getting through all the different areas of the guidance. And even more to their credit, they received almost 250 questions in the chat related to the different aspects of these guidance. And then some months later, because I'm sure it was a tremendous effort, they issued detailed responses to all of these questions that they have received. And you can still watch that webinar on the ECHA website, and you can also get hold of that Q&A document on the ECHA events page. So I'd really recommend that if you're looking to learn more about what has been developed and how these assessments need to be carried out. Another thing that has happened is that iEuclid has been updated so that you can now include these new hazard classes under the CLP classification section for your registered substances. So I believe this was expected to be the main means by which new hazards would be self-classified for REACH registered substances. However, it's difficult to establish the extent to which substances have been self-classified according to these new hazard classes. As I said, I suspect that there are limited new self-classifications, but it's difficult to know. And another related update is that the classification labeling inventory, which has been on the ECHA website for quite a number of years now and had a searchable database, was not able to be searched for these new hazard classes. The CNL inventory has now been migrated over to ECHAChem, which is ECHA's new platform for communicating substance regulatory information on REACH and now also on CLP. But ECHAChem only has currently search features on individual substances. So you can search the specific information on a particular substance, but you can't do a bulk or property search or classification related search like you could in the past with the old system. So hopefully that is something that they are looking at ECHA, and we'll see more searching capabilities in the future, because these are really important insights in terms of how companies are dealing with these new hazard classes and how the regulation is evolving in its implementation. In terms of harmonized classifications, I was able to extract the data for CLH proposals, and I had seen that there were now 5 new proposals for persistent mobile and toxic and very persistent, very mobile substances. There was 1 for PBT, there were 2 for vPvB, and there were 7 for endocrine disruptions between human health and the environment. So it's a steady trickle at the moment, I would say, in CLH proposals. There is one really notable proposal in there from the German Environment Agency related to trifluoroacetic acid and related compounds, which is a really hot topic right now. TFA is a breakdown product of so many different chemicals that we use in everyday life, most notably of the refrigerants that are most commonly used these days, and the environmental concentrations of TFA are going up really fast. We're talking multiples in the past few decades. So that is something that's getting a lot of attention in the media, and we'll see how that plays out in the future. But it's very significant that TFA now has a proposed harmonized classification for reproductive toxicity through the CLH process. So these are just a few of the many things that are happening right now. It seems pretty chaotic, and the pace of change is really fast. There's a lot of new science that's coming through, as I saw recently at CTAC Vienna as well. And so companies and various stakeholders really need to be keeping on top of these things and thinking about what these changes mean for them and how these new scientific developments are translating into new policy and how it's affecting public opinion as well. So this remains as turbulent and dynamic an area as ever. And that concludes this episode of the Chemical Journeys podcast. I hope you found it helpful, and I'm really interested to hear what you're seeing or doing in the area of the new hazards under CLP. Do you perhaps see things differently to the way that I've laid them out here? Feel free to get in touch if you do, or if you have an opinion. Let's get a discussion going on this. As always, your time is really precious, so thank you for spending it with me. This has been Chemical Journeys. I look forward to catching up with you next time. Bye for now.